And a good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Issues and Attitudes. My name is Jeff Owens, Interim Director at WEIU. My co-host is the one and only Daniel Jones.
Hello, Jeff.
And our guest today is a former co-host of this show, Mr. Joe Astrouski, EIU professor and now WEIU documentarian.
Well, yeah, that's fancy.
You like that?
Yes.
Well, welcome, Joe.
Good to be back with you.
Yes, it is. Joe was here a long time ago, and because he's been back at Eastern now for a couple of years teaching, and so, and then interestingly enough, he came to me about a year ago or so and said, hey, what would you think about a documentary to put on WEIU? And I was like, I love new ideas and local programming, and that's kind of where this came about. And so here in a couple of weeks, WEIU Television is going to air a documentary, but I'll let you tell us about the subject and the details.
Right. So the subject is the Shelbyville painter Robert Root. And I became interested in him a couple years ago when I was doing general assignment news reporting. Went down to Shelbyville where they were doing some work on the roof of the courthouse there. And one of the things they were trying to do is to protect this enormous painting of a debate between Judge Thornton and Abraham Lincoln. This was a few years before the Lincoln-Douglas debates that we all know about. This is a more local history. But it was this enormous painting that hangs in the courtroom there. So I interviewed a local gentleman, Ed Bodecker, who's been researching and collecting Robert Root for years and years, and does lots of presentations. And we sat down to talk, and we talked for a half hour, 45 minutes about this painter. And for a minute and a half story, that's not going to fit in there. And I said, I've got to come back at some point and dig deeper into this this fascinating local figure, Robert Root.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about what you know about Robert Root, like his beginnings, his education, and how he became kind of this famous local painter.
Right. So Root grew up in Shelbyville, was born in the 1860s. Family moved just outside of town, and he really developed an interest in nature. He said that one of the most rewarding things he'd ever done, this was in an interview years later, said that one of the most rewarding things he'd ever done was drawing a tree full of blue jays in his backyard. He just loved it as a little kid. So when his family moved back into town, he saw this local artist who'd go around sketching people's houses. I guess if you had spare change back in the day, you'd get somebody to draw your house. And he thought that was just the coolest thing, and he figured he could do that himself, and he did. So we started drawing, and we tell in the show that there was some encouragement that he got locally. Eventually ends up going to study in New York for a short period of time at Washington University in St. Louis at their art school, and then with the support of community members goes and studies in Paris in the late 1800s and gets a real thorough education in art and sort of the cutting edge of painting in that era. And apparently it was sort of expected back then that if you had financial support from your community to go study in Europe, you'd come back and then pay them back by doing work there. Okay. So a small town pays for a local boy to go study in Paris or Berlin, wherever, and then there's sort of an understanding he's going to come back at least for a while and do some work there, portraits and civic pieces and murals, things like that, sort of to pay it back. The interesting thing about Root, though, is he never really left after that. Really was a stellar artist, had an outstanding reputation locally, but really didn't travel much. We know that he went to California once on a little trip to do some painting out there, sort of typical oceanside scenes and things like that. Went up to Wisconsin, painted in the Dells, but mostly stuck around central Illinois. With the exception, by the time he was in his 40s, he goes over to Brown County, Indiana, where there's this artist colony developing, has some friends there and paints with them. So he does some work in Brown County, Indiana, which is a bit hillier than Central Illinois.
A little bit.
And then comes back and produces just a huge variety of work. And I would venture to bet that if you've spent any time in this part of Illinois, you've seen one of his works. And we can talk about exactly what those are. But I believe that most of us, even if we don't know it, have seen something of his.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Where are Maybe where are some places that his works are? Are there any in Coles County, or is it all over by
one
Shelby?
is here on the campus of EIU. He was commissioned to paint a portrait of the first president of Eastern,
Dr. Lord.
Dr. Lord.
Yeah.
Painted. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. If you drive through Shelbyville, the Soldiers and Sailors monument that's across from the courthouse there, big sort of tall obelisk-looking thing, designed that. There are murals locally. Most of us have seen this on television at one time. If you ever see a press conference from the governor's office, usually they do it in the governor's ceremonial office. You know, the governor has an office where he actually works, and then there's this ceremonial office with big high ceilings, lots of plaster and fanciness, big oak desk, and this enormous paneled painting behind the desk. And the painting is of the Lincoln-Douglas debate in Charleston. I venture to say you'd know that if you saw it.
Okay.
Root painted that as part of a contest for the Illinois Centennial. And there's a really interesting story behind that I sort of learned about as I was working on this project. Root painted that painting in the 19-teens as part of a contest, won the contest. Painting was initially displayed apparently at the state fairgrounds. Gets moved to the Capitol. And it was put up down on one of the lower levels, big oak frame. And back in the 80s, for whatever reason, somebody at the Capitol decided, we need to just rotate this thing out. Let's put it in storage for a little bit, get something fresh and new.
The 1980s, right?
The 1980s,
okay,
yeah. The Secretary of State at the time was Jim Edgar, who's from Charleston, said, you know what? As Secretary of State, I get this enormous office, just huge office. I'm going to put it in there. So he got this enormous painting, and I should say it's huge. It's maybe 10 feet across, 6 feet tall, large scene. Edgar has it moved to the Secretary of State's office. When he becomes governor, he has to move to the governor's ceremonial office because he's from Charleston. The painting is of this event from Charleston history. It's gorgeous, and it's put up there behind the governor's desk. I talked to the governor back in May when I was working on this project, and he said that he figured that once he was out of office, it would get moved somewhere else, and it didn't. So Governor Ryan, Governor Quinn, Governor Blagojevich, and now Governor Pritzker have all kept that enormous painting in the governor's office. And in fact, I just got off the phone about an hour ago with the portrait artist who painted the portrait of Governor Edgar that hangs in the Capitol. And really interesting twist here is that when Governor Edgar was having his official portrait painted to hang in the Capitol, got this portrait artist from the Chicago area, comes down and kind of sketches out the portrait and painted it in I think a library somewhere in the Capitol. Shows the governor and his wife his sort of rough version of the portrait. And there was just some random painting in the background. And the governor said, could you do me a favor? Could you swap that out with this Lincoln-Douglas debate painting? Which is difficult because the painting that they were replacing was maybe 2 feet across. This painting from Root is 10 feet. But they made it work, and so if you go to the Capitol, you look at Governor Edgar's official portrait, it has this painting from Robert Root in the background as a tribute because he was so fond of this painting. Also, the governor, about the time he was having this portrait painted, had just had a couple grandchildren, and his wife asked, "Gee, there are a couple little kids in this scene of the Lincoln-Douglas debate. Do you think you could just kind of make them look like our grandkids?" And so they did. So there was this kind of this interesting personal connection there between one of our governors and this painting from the 19-teens of this event that happened in Charleston in the 1850s.
It kind of just wraps it all together. Mm-hmm. That's very cool. That's really cool. The documentary. Give us some details of when and where we can see it the first time when it airs and all that stuff.
So November 11th, Veterans Day at 9:30 in the evening. And just a little under half an hour. So it's not a huge investment of your time, but the one challenge I had when I started on this was I couldn't find a whole lot of photos of Root in sort of that are publicly accessible.
Yeah.
as it turned out, it worked out just fine because his body of work is so impressive and so wide. I just filled up this half hour with shots of his paintings and his designs that are just really, some of them are just stunning, And I think one of the things that really spoke to me is, we don't always think about our part of the country as being beautiful, but I mean, really, whether it's, big horizons, lots of flat ground, sharpness of like a shed against the horizon, or some of our little hills and valleys and forests. I mean, we have some real beauty, and Root saw that. He made a lot of his money doing portraits for families and painting people's dogs and painting ads for tractors and things. But his real passion seems to have been going out in nature and painting it. And I think there's a valuable lesson there that I hope we can get across too in this half hour.
Daniel, any thoughts over there from a perspective?
I've always been interested in some of like the behind the scenes work that goes into documentaries. So can you elaborate a little bit about that? Like maybe some of the things you have to do pre-production?
Yeah, and the thing is, I never really, I come from a news background, right? So the first documentary I worked on was for Wisconsin Public TV. We did a hour-long show about supper clubs, which are this kind of like combination bar restaurant in like Wisconsin. We have a few in Illinois, and so that was kind of my first experience doing this. But the approach I take, which is, I don't know if it's the right one or the wrong one, it's just mine, is any of these stories are going to be about people, and in this case I'm doing a project about somebody who's been gone for 90 years, 80 years, and so for me, one of the things that's more interesting is the people that are really passionate and excited about this painter, right? And so the first thing I did was just go and sit down with some of these people that have studied him for years and collected his work and interview them about their body of knowledge, because they just know a ton. They just know a lot. And I have them show me around their collections, show me pieces of his that they have, take me to the Historical Society and show me pieces that are on permanent display there. So gathering those interviews, gathering those videos. There's a lot of tedious stuff, which is, calling to archives at Washington University and at the Cooper Union in New York and trying to get permission to use photos. That takes a little bit. And so that's some of the kind of slow grunt work. But then the finished thing is, once you have all that and you've kind of gone through the interviews and transcribed them, it kind of comes together and you sort of see, okay, this is the story. Here's from start to finish, beginning to end. Here's kind of the structure this needs to take, and you just sort of write it together. It's sort of like just laying brick, a little bit of my writing, a little bit of an interview, a little bit of my writing, a couple interviews, and it just sort of strings together. And then the thing that's most frustrating is you get to the end and you're like, I want this to be at the right length, and I also want to make sure it doesn't drag. And so you sit down and you watch it yourself once, twice, 3 times through, and you think, okay, when am I getting bored here? And when you are, you're like, I need to do something to pick up the pace here. Maybe I need to add a little bit more what we'd call natural sound, right? The sound of the environment. Maybe I need to add a little bit of music. Maybe I need to just cut this interview here a little bit because it's dragging, and move something later on. But I mean, that's kind of the finished thing. And you really, my producer years ago told me, you just got to be ruthless when you're at that stage. You got to look at it and say, look, this is not going to do anybody any good if the viewer tunes out after like 10 minutes, right? So that's just kind of the process. And the nice thing was, I sort of had some time over these past 6 months to sit down and make phone calls and work on some of this stuff, because I was limited in what else I could do.
That's true. Did you ever find out why Mr. Root stayed here? I mean, he was so prominent. I know the easy answer would be he liked it here, but was there anything else? I mean, family or?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's one of the things. Jeff Lilly, who is one of the experts that I talked to, studied Root for years and years. He helped. So he and the art chair at Millikan about 15 years ago put together a display of Root's work and made a little catalog called Something More Than Praise, which is really cool if you want to check it out. Something More Than Praise, just Google it and you can find some of that. Jeff, who is from Shelbyville, now lives in Indiana, said that's something he's just always wondered, and the only thing he can conclude is that Root just This is where he felt comfortable. This is where he had family, he had friends in the community, and he just had put down roots. And Lily says that is something that we could learn from. Because a lot of people assume that, especially when you're coming right out of school, you assume, I got to go. I've got to get far, and that's not necessarily true. And Root was able to. He really was the go-to person in that part of the state for a number of years, where if you wanted a big civic work done, if you needed something designed, if you wanted a portrait painted, he was the one you went to. And I think there's something to be said for that. And when he died in the late 30s, it was a big deal. The governor of Illinois came. There was a big funeral, a lot written, pages and pages and pages in the newspaper of obituary, which were helpful for me in my research, by the way. But, I think there's something to be said for staying put. Now, on the other hand, because of that, he's not all that well known nationally, right? But he's known here, and maybe had more of a direct impact focusing on this part of the state than if he had just sort of traveled around and been one of 100 painters in New York or Chicago.
Do you know? Does he have any survivors, or was it any family or relatives that you can talk to?
He never married, and I'm sure there are relatives around. I mean, 80 years past. There's really nobody that would have known him directly. But there are a lot. One of the things though that was really interesting is that there are a lot of people who have pieces of his. Often it's been handed down from their mom or from their grandma, and it's stayed in the family. So you kind of have a personal connection to some of these paintings and pieces, which is sort of neat. And
is there any information while you're thinking out there, like how they would describe him as a person? Was he funny, serious all the time?
So, he's, on the one hand, you see paintings of him, and he looks very dignified, and he's very, he's always in a perfect suit and got a nice hat on, a fedora, and everything just looks stellar. But then he'll sneak in these little jokes. Like when he was painting in Indiana, he painted a portrait of one of his fellow artists named Schulz. Adolf Schulz, who was a painter in Indiana as well. Painted a portrait of Schulz, like behind the canvas. But in Schulz's pocket is a little book. He painted a little book that says, How to Paint. So clearly he had a sense of humor, and some of his pieces are really whimsical and, imaginative. So there's some of that there, for sure. I just sort of like to imagine him as because you get the impression that everybody in town sort of knew who he was, that he was just sort of somebody that was, you have the local doctor and you have, the undertaker and the carpenter, and then here was the local creative man, and who just kind of cut an interesting figure.
Tough question, but if he was alive today, what's that one question you'd love to ask him?
I think the question that you asked, which is, why did you choose to stay? Yeah. And one of the interesting things too is for these big historical pieces of the Lincoln-Douglas debate or the Lincoln-Thornton debate, he went back and interviewed the survivors that he could find, and a lot of that took some imagination. So he would take descriptions of who was in a place, and he'd look back at archival information and talk to whoever he could. But then at a certain point he had to just kind of make a creative jump, and just do the thing, And I think knowing how he did that would be interesting.
We're talking to Joe Astrouski. He is an EIU documentarian as well as an EIU professor who has done a documentary on artist Robert Root from nearby Shelbyville. It's going to air on WEIU on November 11th at 9:30. That's kind of a show reset there. We got about 11 minutes left. Daniel Jones, our student. Any other thoughts on your mind over here? You're a little nervous coming into this one because it's kind of a different angle of a show, but it's fascinating to me.
It's kind of fascinating to me too as well. What are some things that you are hoping people take away from watching this documentary?
Good question.
Yeah, one of the things that I really think that there's a lot people could be excited about living in this part of the state and this part of the country, and my hope is that if you see the lens that Root saw this region through, right? That he's able to find beauty in like the way they used to stack, the straw to dry out in the fields, or like in a suspension bridge over the Kaskaskia River, or a little boy, herding cows home, things like that. I think if more of us could see the beauty that he saw in where we live, I think that'd be a valuable thing, because whether it's the natural landscape, whether it's the people of where we are, even the history that he captured, like that's fascinating stuff, And so my hope is that seeing how Root saw our area maybe would help some of us see it better too.
Do you know, did he have anything to do? I know the Chautauqua building's over there. I know it's been in disrepair. They're trying to get it fixed. Did he have anything to do with that?
He did. He designed the stage.
Okay.
Yeah, which has. I couldn't get in to shoot it for this, but we have some archival photos. So he sort of designed the top and frame of the stage there. That's something that you're right. People would have seen if they've.
And what is the status of that? I'm putting you on the spot. The video. I know it's been one of those things.
I think. Yeah, I know that's just been an ongoing. Thing.
They did a lot of money to get that redone, I guess. So, any funny stories or humorous things that happened to you or with you during your research? I know part of the allure of Joe Astrouski is some of the stuff that you walk into when you find things.
Oh, geez, that's a really good question. Well, while I'm thinking of that, I'll say one of the problems I came at when I was finished interviewing all the experts on this is I thought, gee, I'm doing a story about somebody who's been gone for 80 years, and all the photos that I have that are archival are of people that are long dead. I thought, how am I going to make this a little lively? And so I end up finding there's Carol Kessler's in Shelbyville. She runs Flourish's Gallery up there, and retired art teacher. She has a group of fellow art teachers that go out periodically and paint outdoors, plein air, And so I went out on a Saturday and got some nice video of them. That was it was just a really cool thing to see them out there with, their watercolors or their the pastel, doing these paintings. That was pretty impressive.
That's okay.
I hate to say it, I can't think of anything that was all that.
When you were doing your research, did you find anything that Mr. Root wanted to paint but never got the opportunity or chance to? Was there any work left undone?
Oh, that's a really good question. One of the last things he did was an airmail poster. There was a design for a stamp. I don't believe it was ever made into a stamp, but toured the country at postmasters conventions. So he never really traveled that much, but this particular work of his was all over the place. And whenever they'd have I didn't even know there was such a thing, postmasters conventions, this poster would be there. It'd be cool if that someday would end up,
all right,
on a stamp somewhere.
That's cool. It seems like he needs to get a little bit more credit than he's gotten so far. Daniel asked about the process, but the show airs on November 11th, so are you still tinkering with it?
Oh, yeah.
An artist always tinkers until they have to.
Yeah, and I've requested just a couple more photos from people that I want to include. So my goal is to have the whole thing done by this Friday, and then I can, next weekend, sit down and just watch it with a fine-tooth comb 4 or 5 times through and fix everything and have it ready to go.
There you go. And again, it'll air on November 11th here.
And it's airing right after, I believe, some other local programming, correct?
I believe so, and we should have had Mac write all that stuff down for me. Yeah, and it'll also, if you can't DVR or you can't be around on November 11th, it'll air other times as well on WEIU, as well as your 13, which of course we're on live right now. So that's neat. I was going to ask you another question. I mean, since this is your first documentary for WEIU, I know how your mind works, Joe, from knowing you for over a decade now. What are some of the things you're thinking about for Docs 2, 3, 4?
Oh, yeah. Can I tell you one thing? One thing that I've been thinking about is corn, sweet corn. Because, we invented sweet corn.
Yeah.
I mean, we did. But in Illinois,
people in Illinois did.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting story. One thing that I'm really interested in is the idea of like suppers, and by that I mean like sausage suppers, chicken dinners, fish fries. I think it'd be interesting to do a piece on these
clubs that
things that have gone on for 50, 60, 70 years. There's a steak fry in Christian County that I think is in its 55th year. I mean, that's fascinating to me. I
It
think
is.
that'd be great.
That's cool.
Yeah, those are some of the things that are bouncing around up there.
A couple more minutes left. Daniel, anything else in your mind over there, my friend?
I was gonna ask about the documentaries, what he was thinking about doing next.
The other one that I've been thinking about too is, so I'm from Belleville, Illinois, and I've really wanted to. We have a big tradition there of parades, and I think that's just an ungodly number, like 10 parades a year. At one
That's like
point.
Matt Toon has.
Oh, it's
yeah,
like, oh,
yeah.
So I think that'd be an interesting thing. Yeah.
All right. Well, do it.
Has there been any works that you think he has done that no one knows about? Has there been any talk of it?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Ooh.
I don't know. I'm sure there are, because one of the collectors told me that they occasionally will go to auctions and find works of his that aren't advertised as works of his.
Some of the stuff he just commissioned, like locally, like for families or maybe small businesses.
Well, and Ed tells the story, Ed Bodecker, that he was at an auction once, and there was a painting there. It was by Root, but it was called Village in the Distance. But when you looked on the back of the canvas, it actually said Shelbyville on the Kaskaskia. And it was this really neat shot of the skyline of Shelbyville in like 1910. So you see like a water tower, you see the dome of the courthouse. So I would imagine you're probably right. There probably are pieces that are like that one that somebody picked up at an auction, and I just thought it was cool to put over the couch.
All right. The show will air November 11th at 9:30. Let's do rapid fire questions. You want to be involved?
Sure.
All right. Favorite hobby when you were a child was?
Model trains.
I like to dance.
Okay. When things are right again, first thing you're going to go do?
Oh, I may go to a fish fry.
Probably go out to like a party or something.
I don't know that. One little known fact about Joe.
Oh boy.
Put you on the spot there.
Oh jeez.
Daniel, one little fact about you that we don't?
I'm a big Power Rangers fan. I know I'm like
Nothing wrong with
20 years old, but
Oh, I got one. Me and my wife, when we get home at night and are cooking dinner, we'll put on Dr. Phil.
Okay. That doesn't fit. That's okay. Best part of the Thanksgiving meal will be?
Oh, stuffing.
definitely macaroni.
Macaroni. All right. So, how many masks do we have? Because we're in masks. How many masks do you have?
6.
6?
About 5.
I think I got 5 or 6 myself. Favorite Halloween candy? It's Halloween week here.
Snickers.
Probably Snickers too.
Snickers as well. Have you turned your heat on at home yet?
Oh, yeah.
It's been on since early October.
Okay. And your favorite musical artist of all time, Joe, is?
Oh, jeez. Holy moly. Why don't you go and I'll
Mine is easy. It's Beyonce.
I don't know that.
Oh boy, you know I do like Countdown. I used to when I need to get jazzed, I put on Countdown. Shoot, Bob Dylan.
All right. No. All right. The show will air November 11th. It's a documentary about artist Robert Root, produced by Joe Astrouski at Eastern Illinois University documentarian and professor. Thanks for coming in today, Joe.
Thanks, Jeff.
We'll see y'all next week. We're going to talk about EIU basketball next week. I know you're excited, Daniel.
Super excited.
We are WEIU.